So I want to thank you for coming tonight, and I just want to give you a little game plan. The session is a little different in that I see myself as the opening act, and then Myrna will be speaking to us about her work. It's something new that we're trying in the program committee that uh, a little different from a panel in that somebody who's working in an area is newer, even though I'm not a young person, I'm young to this field, might open for somebody who has a fuller research uh, program in that area. So I am going to share my screen. We practice this, so it better work. Okay, great. And what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about my own, some of my own work. And also why these slides not advancing. Okay, do it that way. Um, and and some of the ideas that resonate with me particularly as an anthropologist. So just a little bit about me as an anthropologist. I'm a medical anthropologist. My anthropology is based on my clinical experience as a nurse. My research portfolio was pretty broad and included things like HIV prevention, cancer prevention, and treatment access, and some nursing science, some things that were very specific to nursing science, like end of life and palliative care and symptom science. 4 years ago, I retired, and I put quotes around it because it's been a very busy 4 years. Um, I'll give you a little insight into myself. For my entire adult life, I've always had these two arms that I've been trying to balance, which has been spirituality and social activism. And my sort of goal is to marry these two issues. As also part of my retirement career, I got myself another degree. It's a Doctor of Ministry in Jewish spirituality, and my focus is on anti-Semitism, trauma, and resilience. So I'm going to go over a little terminology here. So anti-Semitism, a lot of people realize that it's a pretty made-up term. It doesn't mean much, and that's why most people at this point have taken out the hyphen
Mm-hmm.
because it's not against Semitic peoples. If that were so, it would be all Semitic peoples. This is specific to Jewish people. And it was a term popularized by a German journalist in the late 19th century, and he was using pseudoscientific theories of race. And unfortunately, as we well know, much of anthropology at that time was very racist and used as an underpinning for eugenics and white supremacy. More accurately, what we're talking about is anti-Jewish oppression. And to really understand what that is, we need to take into account the great diversity of Jews globally and also diversity of Jewish expression about Jews who are seemingly similar to each other. That would be, not all white Ashkenazi Jews practice Judaism in the same way. Same thing for Sephardi or Mizrahi Jews. And just point of information, Ashkenazi Jews are mainly those who hail from Eastern Europe. Sephardi Jews are those who hail from Spain, although they might have been dispersed uh, far and wide, including to Eastern Europe. And Mizrahi Jews are referred to Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. So it's probably no surprise that there's more than one definition of anti-Semitism and that there's no real agreement on what is the best definition. And this would be a much longer presentation if I went into several of them. So I'm going to tell you what I found useful as an anthropologist. as an anthropologist who worked in evaluation most of my career, I like things that can be operationalized. Um, so this is a model from Sherry Brown and Amy Leos Erbel. And the first point is they call anti-Semitism the systematic, institutionalized mistreatment of Jews. So it isn't just that somebody doesn't like a Jewish person. That could be anti-Semitic behavior for sure. But the point here is that for at least for a couple thousand years, um, anti-Semitism was, it served ruling classes, served people in power to maintain their status. And the key elements of anti-Semitism are blame, which could manifest as scapegoating, isolation, and terror. And in thinking about this, I realized that one can feed into the other. Being blamed can lead to isolation and can lead to terror, or they could be sort of operating in a feedback loop. So, an example, a kind of common example, we talk about sometimes Jews were forced into a middle agent role. And a prime example of that would be in Europe. I'm thinking specifically of what was called the Russian Pale of Settlement, which included much of today's Ukraine, where Jews were not allowed to own land, but they could be employed as rent collectors. So when the peasants should have been rising up against the landlords and the ruling class, instead, they would terrorize the Jewish population. So we are in a cycle of anti-Semitism now, or I should say, anti-Semitism is cyclical. I can only hope that we've reached the peak and now the cycle will start turning down. It does look like it's still peaking. The reported incidence of explicitly anti-Semitic propaganda more than doubled from 2021 to 2022. And the Anti-Defamation League, which is a pretty mainstream organization, considered these incidents as serving a white supremacist agenda. So what I've been thinking about in these years is how educating ourselves and intervening with regard to anti-Semitism can strengthen work across those who are working towards a diverse, inclusive, and egalitarian society. In other words, what I'm talking about here is ally building across different movements, be it anti-racist, being anti-homophobic, and even anti-Islamophobic. So there are other sources of confusion, and these sources of confusion are not just with regard to Jewish people and anti-Semitism. They're certainly manifest in other oppressed groups. And what I'm talking about here is internalized oppression, which is the internalization of hurtful messages against oneself and each other. And they can be a manifestation of fear due to intergenerational trauma. So wanting to shape of somebody's nose, changing somebody's last name, it's very interesting. I'm not going to say this is scientific data. This is just conversations with people. The idea that, oops, things are not going well. I got to pack my bag and be ready to leave. And also keeping secrets across generations. There's a wonderful book by Tirsa Firestone called Wounds into Wisdom, in which she talks about how family secrets can affect the next generation. And also, I will confide to you that I'm a bit of a TV enthusiast. I won't say addict. I've been watching Henry Louis Gates's program, Finding Our Roots, and it's fascinating how some of his Jewish um, the celebrities who come on the show know so little or nothing about what their families endured in the 1930s and 1940s. Microaggressions is a term that many of us have heard about, and maybe we've been on the end of them or fearful that something we said innocently might be taken that way. Microaggressions are often disguised as compliments, such as, well, you're so good with money. And if the recipient protests, they might be characterized as too sensitive. What I was really interested in, um, coming out of some work that I was doing at NIH with regard to in the HIV prevention world, how to reach people from different populations. It was the idea of historical trauma. And this definition comes from Maria Braveheart. She is a social work scientist, in which she says that historical trauma is the cumulative, multi-generational collective experience of emotional and psychological injury in communities and in descendants. And we also know that some of this trauma can actually be biologically encoded through the epigenome.
Yep.
But as a cultural anthropologist, I found this model, again, I love models, from Jeffrey Alexander, who's a sociologist, in which he talks about collective trauma as a process that's fueled by individual experience, but is a threat to the collective. And it's that threat, it's that collective threat that defines suffering. So to me, this, and also I'm taking this quote out of context, it's really about cultural processes and not just individual processes, or certainly the individual within the larger culture. So collective trauma is a meaning, it's an opportunity to make meaning out of, in this case, out of unfathomable grief. And I'm using the example in Alexander's 2012 books. He uses several examples, and not all of them related to the Holocaust and Jewish history. But in his discussion of the Holocaust, we want to keep in mind that in processing collective trauma, it's a dynamic process. And it's the development of a group understanding that is crucial to identity. So he has three phases for meaning making coming out of the Holocaust. And the first phase, I'd say roughly through maybe the 1950s, is the triumph of good over evil. The Allies defeated the Nazis. We were good, they were evil, and now we're all going into a brighter future so long as we defeat communism. The second phase is that this was the unique experience of, and I'm putting Ashkenazi Jews in brackets because the focus was really on Ashkenazi, that this was an Ashkenazi experience, and I've even seen critical literature that's quite recent. But as I said earlier, Sephardi Jews were dispersed throughout Europe and the Middle East, and and there was some impact as well on Middle Eastern populations, and certainly impacts after the Holocaust. And then the other attempt at making meaning, the third phase, and probably interacting probably about the same time, is that the Holocaust is part of a universal experience of evil. It was one of many horrors of the late 20th and unfortunately so far of the 21st century. And looking at the literature for how to attain some sort of meaning some sort of healing through meaning making. Of course, the two giants in the Jewish post-Holocaust experience are Viktor Frankl, who I'm really not sure if this is what he meant or not. Myrna probably, maybe you can speak to that. But I see his perspective as more universal, that we all have this core, this existential core, and if we can be rooted in that existential core, that existence is the source of meaning. Elie Wiesel talks about bearing witness to guard the memory of the unique Jewish experience, but in order to create a better future. So it's both particular and universal. Tirsa Firestone, I think I mentioned her a few slides back. She interviewed a number of people, including Holocaust survivors living in Israel, one of whom talked about converting suffering into kindness. So again, at the particular, but using that as a way um, to again create a better future, live a better future. Also, theoretically, moving beyond anthropology, I became familiarized to become an expert in phenomenology. That would be another lifetime, but I became familiarized with phenomenological approaches and lived experience. So, according to Van Manen, who is a phenomenologist of education, a definition of lived experience is our immediate pre-reflective consciousness of life. I was particularly interested in this because of the bodily experience of lived experience. The body is the repository of lived experience. So, what did I do with all this? In the summer of 2020, I developed what I call a facilitated spiritual direction workshop. Spiritual direction is a process of companioning other people. It's the process is a way of helping them to extract and develop meaning from their own lived experience. And that meaning may, although and the people I worked with, not necessarily involve spirit, God, or divinity. It in the workshop, which was multi-session, the hope was that creativity would be a vehicle for making meaning of past experience. Interestingly, this was the summer of 2020, and it bore out that participants were more concerned with issues related to COVID and to the anti-racist activism of the summer of the spring of 2020 and on into summer than anti-Semitism per se and Jewish collective trauma. There were a number of people who were quite isolated and quite cautious about doing any action outdoors. And for some of them, this was their first experience of sitting out a major social movement. Um, Subsequently, as I said, anti-Semitic incidents have increased, but also I've been working in spaces where I've been doing kind of one-off presentations. So I've been doing a greater focus on anti-Semitism specifically, and this also reflects both concern and discouragement from participants regarding these increasing incidents. But what I try to convey is a recognition that addressing anti-Semitism is not an either or. Either we address anti-Semitism and that's all we do, or we address other issues in our larger community, really our nation and globally, because that would also include climate change. So again, this is about ally building as part of a more general pro-democracy agenda. So that is a little bit about where I've been coming from. I will say that the link I have with Myrna, and I didn't go over these questions with you, so please, Myrna, if you want to change anything, but some things that we could think about again, because I think the link here is the meaning making activity, is what was daily life like for women in the Holocaust who were faced with the most dire circumstances imaginable. And then I think you're going to be hearing about how women scholars might have made a meaning differently than the men who were in the mainstream of Holocaust research. And afterwards, it would be wonderful if we could have a discussion about what this means for us during a time of rising anti Semitism, as well as so many other issues that we're coping with. Um, in terms of um, racism and many ways that I believe we've been going backwards in our country and in the world in terms of human liberation. I think what we can do um, is I'll take maybe up to 5 minutes worth of questions on anything I've said, and then hand it over to Myrna. And then, Myrna, you can have as much time as you want, leaving time for questions and discussion at the end. Now, my husband told me I went too fast, so if there's anything that I said that you missed and you want me to go over, I'll be happy to do that.
I need to say something. Okay. You
Uh,
mentioned early on the needing to leave, part of anti-Semitic or anti-Semitism responses, or the
mhm,
fear of anti-Semitism. About 15 years ago, Elie Wiesel called a special meeting, uh, and I was invited to it. And at that time, and I'm talking about 15 years ago, he invited key people from various countries, England, France, Belgium, so on, and even South Africa. And they were talking about the rising anti-Semitism and what's going on in these countries. And almost to a person, they said, Jews in our country, especially in the UK, have a suitcase in the closet so that they be ready to leave on a moment's notice. That was 15 years ago. It has never left me. And Wiesel was stunned. I mean, here's a man who lives, anti-Semitism and what it is all about. And he was shocked. It's happening again, he thought. But I just had to make that comment.
mhm. Yeah, I didn't talk about as part of this process, this journey over the past 4 years. I did spend 2 weeks studying anti-Semitism at Oxford. This was 2019. So we were well into the Trump years, and it was towards the end of the Jeremy, what's his name? Can't believe I blocked on his name.
Corbyn.
Years, Jeremy Corbyn years in the UK. It was interesting that the different experiences of people from Europe. There were even people from Africa,
Mhm.
as well as Israel, and I can't remember if anybody was there from South America. I think there was. I'm not sure. Um,
But your
okay,
topic goes right into the, leads right into the Holocaust.
that's right. So I do want to introduce you
Oh, okay.
because so by now we did have so I just want to say that Myrna Goldenberg, Dr. Goldenberg, has contributed to many books on women in the Holocaust, and she's won the Canadian Jewish Literary Award on Holocaust literature. She's taught at Montgomery College and University of Maryland, as well as Keene State College in New Hampshire. and she served as the Ida B. King Visiting Scholar of Holocaust Studies at Stockton College, New Jersey. She's a founding member and advisory council fellow of the Weinstein Symposium on the Road to Responsibility in the Age of Shoah, also in Oxford, England. And here's where she's like my total role model, although she's retired, in quotes, from academe. Myrna continues to lecture widely and conduct research on Jewish women. And she and I together thought that this talk would be particular germane to Women's History Month, as we learn not only about the impact of Holocaust on on gender, but also on how researchers write about women.
Yeah. Thanks, Martha. I guess it's my turn, right?
It
Okay.
is.
Yes. My topic is women in the Holocaust, but I have to say at the outset, women were not targeted because they were women. All Jews, men, women, and children were targeted for death. And it's as blunt as that. So in order to study a subject, I and my colleagues who work in this field feel as though you have to talk about the particularities of the Holocaust if you're going to understand it, because it's such a broad topic and has so many diverse parts. Well, one of the particularities is women. And it happens, I as a women's studies scholar, naturally, that's what I'm going to talk about, women in the Holocaust. But I want you to also realize that right after World War II, for the first 2 decades, there was nothing about the Holocaust in our lives. Really, nothing. It was silence. Any voice that was heard was a male voice. And people did not want to talk about it. Non-Jews didn't want to talk about it, possibly because they felt guilty. Jews, to some extent, felt guilty as well, but I have no evidence of that, only anecdotal kind of evidence. But nothing really substantive happened until we did have women writing memoirs, men writing memoirs. The women's memoirs were published in small amounts and never republished until the 80s, when we made sure they were republished. But everything changed with the Eichmann trial in 1960. The witnesses were both male and female, and it opened up the field. The Holocaust became a public topic after the Eichmann trial. That's the year that Wiesel's Night was published in English. And the year later, one of the most important books still on the Holocaust was published by Raoul Hilberg, wrote from University of Vermont, wrote The Destruction of the European Jews. And it's still a standard, as old as it is. It's remarkable. It got so, the Holocaust as a public topic got such attention that in 1978, you may remember, if you're almost as old as I am, a TV program for 4 nights running on Holocaust. And the star was Meryl Streep, a non-Jew, acting as a non-Jew in the story. And the focus, she was really dominant. So that to me is very interesting. It took a while for a Jewish person to be the major character in a TV program on the Holocaust. And then finally in 1980, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum was open. And there we have the remarkable, attention paid to the subject. It was, and it's only slightly now, a male-dominated field. Women in the Holocaust as a subtopic or as a particularity was very controversial. 1998, Gabriel Schoenfeld from Commentary Magazine published an article challenging me and 6 other women feminist scholars. He didn't really challenge us. He condemned us for diluting the subject of the Holocaust by bringing up women. And then he took his article and he published a part of it on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. There was such an uproar. I mean, he did not win that fight, and that was good because people said, "What are you talking?" I mean, women were half the Jews, and so you have to talk about women and find out how their lives, just as you said, how their lives differed from men's, because men and women during the Holocaust were separated. The Nazis targeted them both, but women were exploited in a different way. And that's where my field is. I want to also let you know there was a clue to the importance of women during that time by a historian named Emanuel Ringelblum. He was the historian of the Warsaw Ghetto. And 1943 was the end of the ghetto. He collected data, he collected magazines, newspapers, artwork, letters, everything he could that reflected life in the ghetto. And he put them into 4 huge milk cans. And we only found 2 of them. He buried them. We don't know where the other 2 are. One is in Yad Vashem, one is in the Holocaust Museum here. But he wrote, this was important, the future historian would have to dedicate a proper page to Jewish women during this war. She will capture an important part of this Jewish history for her courage and ability to survive. Because of her, many families were able to get over the terrors of these days. Now that's 1943. By then, almost 2 million Jews were murdered, but he didn't know that. He was stuck in Warsaw. So we're studying what happened to women. Well, in the ghettos, what's important to know is that women had to take over the roles of men to a major extent, because by the middle of the 30s, after the Nuremberg laws, it was clear to many men, that they had to leave and find another place to live and take their family and start a new way in a new life. And they left Germany, they went to France, Belgium, and America, and some to what was then Palestine. But the population left in Germany by 1938 or so was 136 women to 100 men. So it was a female-dominated country in terms of Jews at that time. And there was certainly, you're an anthropologist, you couldn't understand what that did to men who remained. They were no longer the head of households. They were no longer the breadwinners. Everything was reversed. Women took over all the roles of the family because men, they were gone, many of them. And 2, if they were outdoors, they would be subjected to roundups. And roundups meant you were taken, you may never see your family again, but you were taken to a labor camp or put into slave labor. And so women stood on lines, women were the ones on the streets to protect the men. Also, you have to recognize at that time, how things have changed, that it wasn't, people did not think that the Nazis would arrest women and children. It was not normal, pardon me, it was not normal to arrest the women and children. When you went to war, you fought the men. And the men were therefore the proper victims. So we have a situation where when women were when women were arrested, people were stunned. Let me give you one example. France, Paris, 1942, July, already an occupied country. And Paris police get word that Berlin wants all the Jews rounded up. It got out. Somebody told somebody, a Jewish policeman told, so it got out. And most of I don't have figures, but it is stated that most of the Jewish men didn't go home to sleep that night, because they knew when it was going to happen, and they stayed away. So early in the morning, I think around 4,500 French policemen rounded up what they thought would be all total Jewish families. They actually got 11,000 Jews rounded up. 4,500 of them were children, and very few men, relatively speaking. And those that they got were the old men, because they didn't have they didn't think they'd be arrested. And they took them to a place called Velodrome, which was a sports arena. They kept them there for almost a week without food, without sanitary conditions. And finally, they put the adults on a bus, took them to the various transit camps in France, and then to Auschwitz, where they were immediately murdered. The children were left, and the Nazis decided they can't be left. Himmler said, they'll just look for vengeance if we let them grow up. So they put them on a bus too, and took them to Auschwitz to be murdered. This tells us the mentality. We were not, as a world, prepared for the total annihilation of a people. And that was the aim, that was the intention of the Nazi regime. I think it was Himmler who said, we have to make these people, we have to banish them from the earth. Well, think back, we were not used to equal opportunity murder of men and women in war. African tribes used to take their women away when there was war, so they would protect them, keep them safer from, getting them away from the warfare. Well, we used to call these people uncivilized. Well, no way. Anyway, let me go to the subject. I do digress, that you'll have to just bear with me. I have a lot to say, so I do digress. In the ghettos, women were doing what I said. They were taking control of the family. There was very little food in any of the ghettos. In the Lodz ghetto, I believe that Jews were allowed 12 cents a day of food, 12 cents a day of food. And that was pretty much all of Poland at that point, all the Polish, all the Jewish areas. You don't survive on that. And there was a lot of death. There was a lot of smuggling. Women in the ghettos were smugglers. Children were smugglers, because they could manage to get through the fences, and people didn't expect them to be smugglers. So they managed to bring in food. They were caught many times. A woman who was caught smuggling was usually murdered, but the kids were usually let go. We also see that when the ghettos were liquidated, a German word for this, not mine, many of the women stayed. Many of the women would not leave the elders. Wherever the elders were taken, these women went with them. It's important to realize that there were hundreds of camps, because a camp was a place where Jews were enslaved. Jews were collected and enslaved. So a factory could be a camp. The SS, by the way, was paid for each Jew working in one of these factories. That men were paid. Men brought in more money than women, but they still brought in a ton of money, because we had so many Jews who were rounded up. I need, before we go to camps, because it's a subject that is not talked about very much, in June of 41 through the next year and a half, the Nazis reneged on their treaty or pact with the Soviet Union, and in an operation called Operation Barbarossa, they invaded the Soviet Union. Just a dumb thing to do. But what they did was they sent what we call Einsatzgruppen, special forces, into four different groups, divided by geography. The northernmost, the middlemost, the eastern and southernmost, for the express purpose of rounding up the Jews and killing them. About 1.5 million Jews were murdered this way. That period was called the Holocaust by bullets. This preceded gas chambers, gas vans. This was what happened. And it's very seldom talked about because it's too much to get, too much to think about. There's a marvelous priest teaching at Georgetown who wrote the book, The Holocaust by Bullets, because he got interested in his grandfather's statement that I had it bad, but they had it worse. And he finally found out his grandfather was talking about the Jews. His grandfather was taken for slave labor, but he was a Catholic, but everyone, he was still taken. And Father Patrick then investigated what his grandfather meant by they had it worse. And because of the collar, he was able to talk to a lot of people, bring groups together and so on. And they showed him where these murder sites were. He made, his project was to go to every one of them in Ukraine and to identify where they were, say Kaddish. He usually had a rabbi with him and a team, and make sure that that spot, that murder site, whether it was 10,000 Jews or 100 Jews, 500 Jews, that's identified and covered over so there would not be any more grave robbing. That Einsatzgruppe, but I raise it not only to tell you more about what went on, but also this was a time when the German soldiers raped women by the dozens. They would gather a group of Jews, pick out the girls or the young women, humiliate them, make them, serve them a meal naked, dance, torture them, rape them, and then murder them. And as I said, about 1.5 million Jews were murdered that way, and women were particularly well used and tortured and murdered. This is not much written about it, but that is what happened from Lithuania down to Odessa. It's the Einsatzgruppe in these 4 squads. Well, okay. But what most people are focused on is the camps, what happened in the camps. When a ghetto was liquidated, the people in that ghetto were put on trains and they were taken, usually cattle cars, and they went to one of 100 different camps. But the death camps, which is what most people want to know about, there were 6 of them. The death camps, the purpose of a death camp was just that, gas chambers and murder. There was, when the train reached the destination, there was a ramp that was built, and on that ramp, men and women were separated, one to the left, one to the right. And those people, men and women, who were under 15 or over 45, and this is about, because they didn't look for birth certificates, okay? People who could not be useful for work, for slave labor, were allowed to live. All the rest were gassed with their children. Pregnant women were useless, so they were gassed also. Women holding little children or children by the hand were gassed because it was easier than separating the mother and the child and causing a ruckus because they'd be crying and so on. So they were gassed also. In all, usually 85 to 95% of a transport was gassed. I hesitate, this is hard for me to talk about, even though I've talked about it for 40 years, because when I come to terms with those numbers, it just floors me, it really does. Anyway, if the women who did not get gassed were then put into barracks, 800 to 1,000 women to a barrack, usually a barrack normally could hold 8 horses. So the horses were out and the barracks were emptied for these women. Men were also put in a separate camp. There was just one instance of a family camp, but that camp was short-lived and all of them were murdered at Auschwitz. So they had different camps of men and women. My focus was on what did women do? What was their life like? Well, it wasn't pretty good. They were starved. They were subject when they were processed. That's the word I have to use because that's what happened. They were processed into a camp. They were humiliated. They were made to be naked. Now, you think about a religious or a very religious or a religious person who is taught modesty and then is made to be naked in front of all these SS men. They were jeered, they were touched, and then they were shaved, body shaves, and the shaves were done by male inmates. They were then processed into barracks and so on, and the starvation began because they were fed so little that their menstruation stopped. And that's caused a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, because that would be the end of the people. If women didn't menstruate, they thought that was it. It was really a focus for a lot of women's memoirs. Women also had a different kind of experience than men because of their pre-camp experience. At that point, we're talking about early 20th century. We have women who normally were domestic bound. You have separate spheres. You know this from your own work. And women in the camps, when they came back from work, tended to sit down and nurture one another. They formed surrogate families. And it's a very important phenomenon because that's why so many women survived, or as many women survived as they have. Women attribute their survival usually to the caring of another woman or set of women. You don't find that same happening in men's memoirs, except rarely. I mean, it'll stand out because it's not common, but it is common in the women's memoirs. One survivor, Isabella Leitner, I think she began her book with the sentence, "If you are sisterless, you don't have the responsibility, the absolute responsibility, to end the day alive." That tells you a lot about the kind of camaraderie and surrogate family life that they had. Usually, if an SS officer recognized that a family was together, he would separate them. So they had to hide the fact that they were sisters or aunts and so on, or that they were related. But surrogate families took the place of natural families. There were natural families who managed to hide the fact that they were related. And they talked about what was relevant to them, and that generally was food. Starvation was the topic. Hunger. One woman writes, "We told time by hunger. Hunger in the morning, hunger in the afternoon, hunger at night, and so on." Hunger was a prevalent talk because feeling, because they were starved. And when you're starved, your resistance is low, and they caught all kinds of diseases, typhus, typhoid, and so on. And they died. Many of them died of disease that was really the result of not eating or bad diets and so on. They also when they talked about food, they tended to share recipes. Now, picture this. You are in a barracks that's filthy. The barracks had 3 tiers of bunks, very little light, dirt. There were no showers. They didn't take showers. Mud. Hunger was on their mind. bugs, all kinds of bugs, and they're talking about recipes. And it kept them looking towards a future, talking about the past recipes that they imagined, that they knew, they did not know, I'll explain that in a minute, kept them from focusing on the misery that they had. They taught each other how to cook, although for the most part, these women never had time in the kitchen. They were many of these households were multi-generational, and so the older women did the cooking and the younger women did whatever they did with the kids. But they will admit that they didn't know what they were talking about, but they dreamt of these fantasy recipes, and it was a life-saving mechanism for some. Also, you have to think about the interaction between a Belgian woman and a French woman and a Polish woman, all talking about the best pastry and how to make the best pastry. This is a diversion that's healthy, not dwelling on the misery that they will live in. They called it, they would rub their stomachs, and they called it, a survivor told me, gastronomic masturbation. And I mean, the creativity of that floors you. They also called it cooking with the mouth, because as I said, they were seldom experts in the kitchen. And although you have quite a number of cookbooks that came out of the various camps, I would not suggest that you follow the recipes to the T. These were remembered recipes, not actual recipes. So I don't know that the ingredients, I love these cookbooks because they usually have little stories in them, but I don't use them to learn how, to make a dish, because as I said, they're remembered, and memory is not always accurate. Let's see, what else can I tell you? We have time, but I want to know, I want to find out what you want to know as well. When you study women in the Holocaust, you also study resistance. And resistance is normally considered armed or military, but the women who talk about their memories and so on talk about resistance, survival as resistance. And they're very proud of that, to be able not to buckle, to be able to have, and I think Frankl talks about this, make meaning to their lives, connect with something that gives them a reason to live. That is survival to them. That is very much survival to so many of them. But there were women who were military partisans who went on those raids, went into Nazi holdouts and on their horses, and grabbed whatever and had a rifle and grabbed whatever they needed to grab in order to sometimes destroy the Nazi, hold out there. Women also, partisan women, worked on the railroads. Whatever you do to make a train not go right, they did that. Blew up bridges and so on. I'd rather you ask me questions now, because I have so much on my, on my mind. I would like to know what you want to know.
You can use the raise hands, or we're small, so
Anything, whatever
yeah.
you think. There's one person in the chat. Let me see if it's to me. Oh, The Light of Days. Okay. That's a more recent book. It draws on a lot of research. Judy did a lot of research. She doesn't interpret the stories that she writes about. These are stories of women who in the Holocaust, and what they did and how they survived. She doesn't interpret them, but she lists them. So you have a compendium, many women's stories. and it's an important source. Yeah. Her research is vast, really vast.
Yeah.
I have talked you out, or
So,
give me
Can you say anything about women in the resistance, Jewish women in the resistance?
yes, I have to go to do that. I have to talk about partisans. Women were there's a difference between Jewish partisan groups and non-Jewish partisan groups. The Jewish partisan groups, for the most part, accepted women. And there was a huge one, the Bialski brothers. They had women doing women's work, nursing, cooking, and so on and so forth. And it went on for quite a while until they had to break it up because the Nazis got wind of them. It was normal for a male partisan, to take on a woman as his mistress. And in order to survive, women did that. But there were women who were raiding the Nazi camps. I mean, and who went in search of food. There are beautiful photographs of women who have the bandoliers, with the bullets. These women had a lot of guts. These women decided that that's what they could do. There were also women in the partisan groups who were essentially nurses. And some of the Bialski boys, for example, had children in their group, which is very rare because here they are in the forest trying to not be noticed. And there they have kids. But the Bialski brothers had such a huge group. They had multi-generational. Usually partisan groups were not nearly as big. There are also women you have to talk about who passed, and that is a way of resistance too, meaning women's bodies did not denote them as Jews the way men's bodies did. If a woman was a blonde, blue-eyed kind of thing, and if they had studied in the public schools, so they didn't have accents or a Jewish accent, but they would be able to try to pass. But you have to think about what it's like to be in a town or a city trying to pass and the fear that someone would recognize you, because if someone did recognize you, that was the end. We were in Berlin and going into one of the subways, and a woman next to me, and we were in a group, said, "This is important. This subway is important to me. My parents ducked into this subway to get away from someone who recognized them and was chasing them." And they got to the end of the subway. And if you've been in Berlin, there's usually a conductor type person at the end. And this person recognized that this couple was running away, trying to hide, trying to get safety. He stopped them. He gave them a key to his house in the country. Amazing. And they went there and they survived the war. Now, this is an amazing story. And I just learned it by accident. We were walking down the U-Bahn together. And she could see that we were, I was interested in this subject. So women as resistors, yes, women who try to pass, women who were in the partisan group. And then there were the women, not necessarily Jewish, who saved children, who rescued people. There were whole networks of rescuers in southern France, for example, in the Charbonne. It's amazing. This is the kind of a story that your heart says, oh, how you would like to be as strong as these people. I don't know if I told you enough, but
I want to thank you for bringing it out, because the linchpin in the light of day is the fact that women could pass.
That's right.
that they were not able to be immediately identified. And also what was stressed in the book and her interpretation and the way she worked with her material was that they were organized, that they knew various other ghettos and went from place to place. And the danger is leaving. When you leave the ghetto, when you leave a building, you are
Vulnerable.
very vulnerable. You're entering, you could be killed. And she shows how they go about it. Another issue brought up that I found really is sex, is the degradation of females, the brutality, the use of animals,
Yeah.
etc. I mean, she really had that in there as well, and that's one aspect of brothels or whatever that hasn't been in the literature. But she really shows the
Actually, it
war.
has. Women talk about degradation to a lot because it was so traumatic.
And pervasive. But I don't think for the general reader like myself that it was there. And I thought that this book really fought the stereotype that people went passively, and they didn't. And she did a great job in describing the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and all that they went through. And as you know, your work, you are the editor of a book that's in her bibliography there.
Yeah. But let me say that right after World War II, the rumor was, or the word was, Jews went to like sheep to the slaughter. That was absolutely exposed by the Eichmann trial. Jews did not. There were uprisings in every single major camp and in every major ghetto. Jews were very, very active in fighting for their rights to live. Yeah. And but that normally, if you read memoirs, the urge to live is so strong, it's so powerful that these women are role models for the rest of us who are living freely. But women could not live freely and pass if they didn't have the experience prior to being deported of living in a mixed society. So the women, as I said, even in the religious homes, the women went to the public school, the women went to the shops, the women interacted with the non-Jewish community, and they were able to get along. They knew how to act, they knew what to say, and they didn't give themselves away by an accent or by their clothing, because they really knew, they had to work in the quote secular world. So they did that. Yeah. But I think it's also important to recognize, because we talk about gender, men are gender too, that even if the men managed to not be caught up in a roundup, they had a very hard time because their status changed so radically by the Nazi domination, and they didn't get their jobs. Right away in 1933-34, they were fired. Professors were fired, doctors were fired, teachers were fired. Jewish men lost their status as breadwinners, and that had an effect on them. But it also made the women get out there and do the job of men too. My husband is in this room. He one topic that came late to the research field of this was rape. There was one of the Nuremberg laws, the second one, talks about prohibits Aryans from having physical contact sex with Jews. It's called Rassenschande. It was it was supposed to keep men from raping Jewish women. The further you are from Berlin, the less it was followed, because if you're in the hinterlands of Lithuania, Latvia, and so on, there's no one to report you. But even in Berlin, there were rapes. There were also rapes in the camps. Women, we have to understand this, women often, when they could, use their bodies for bartering for food. That's important. And there are historians, there are women, and there are men who condemn them for that. I'm not one of them. I think that it is a reasonable thing. If you want to feed yourself, if you want to survive, you have to succumb. And in fact, one survivor said the best advice she got from her mother was, when they separated so that they had a better chance of surviving, was do anything in order to survive. That's important. And so she did. She had to survive. Things change, values change. In the camps, there were what we call runners. There were Jewish male electricians, Jewish male plumbers who went from one camp to another, from the male camp to the women's camp, and so on. And it was not unusual to have to succumb to their advances. In the camps, there were also SS men who raped. I interviewed a woman at length. We were sitting in one part of the house and she was whispering, so her husband, who was way over on the other side of the house, shouldn't hear. She said to me, she was told that an SS man was after her. So she tried to hide, but he caught her in one of the barracks and he raped her. She never got over it. It was she was young and she was not savvy. She was very protected. And she, even in her 70s, was still traumatized by it. Another woman, I was sitting with her, this was in Hungary. She was in Hungary. She said, and her husband was watching Judge Judy. I will never forget this. While he was watching that, she whispered to me, she said, I was raped, but he doesn't know and the children don't know. This is what survival in such a circumstances entails. You can't condemn these women. They are not what they used to call damaged goods. There was a time when women who were raped were labeled damaged goods in the Jewish community and elsewhere. These are not damaged goods. These are survivors. And God bless them. I mean, more power to them. Okay, what else can I talk about? Give me some more that you'd like to have me talk about. I am immersed in this subject for 40 years. I think it's 40 years now. Yeah, nice, 1980s, and 83. And I don't know anthropology, so I did not know how to write an anthropological, twist to this. I do this as history and as women's studies. So sorry about that. But rape,
No,
it took a long time before rape was even acknowledged. The first interviewers were men. They did not know what to say or how to say it. Even when there were men who knew how to ask, were you raped or were you violated, any way they want to put it, there were women who could not say yes. And very often you had women who talked about someone else who was raped and she was a witness to that rape when actually she's talking about herself. We have a bunch of cases like that. And that's understandable too. yeah. Again, my husband in the behind me is talking about Sarajevo. Yeah, we were in Sarajevo and we met with women who were raped and what it meant to them and how degrading. Rape itself is degrading, but when you put that in the context of being deliberately humiliated and taunted and made to be called an insect, a cockroach, a pig, and it's constant at you, and you're not fed and you're not allowed to wash. How do you, what a wonderful strength the women had to be able to survive that and rise above it. Every female Holocaust survivor that I interviewed and watched them talk to other audiences would always say, what you have to know is you have to be kind. They never took on the bitterness that was that was, you know, a possibility for them. Kindness was always be kind, be respectful, have dignity. Don't let this happen again. And I'm just in awe of these women that I have interviewed and know. I respect them tremendously. Now, there are many, many, many Holocaust survivors, or were, they're dying out in great numbers, who were so traumatized by the war that they can't talk and haven't been able to talk. And we have to understand that those who are able to talk to us may not be telling, you can't generalize to the rest of the population of Holocaust survivors. Many were damaged. One woman told me that when she closes her eyes, she sees her life as a survivor in 2 camps in the inside of her eyelids. Now, to go to sleep at night and have that experience is not easy. It isn't. One of my survivor friends managed she was in a small, horrible camp. And she escaped with a man who was her husband. They were married in the camp. And they stole a rowboat. They crossed the Elbe River to get to the American side that didn't want to get to the Russian side. They didn't want to be caught, liberated by Russians. So they went to the American side. She said what stunned her was a grown men playing with a little ball. They were playing baseball. And the GIs recognized that these were survivors, Jewish survivors. They took them to a liberated, they called it a liberated house, probably a house that was abandoned by the German families who lived there. And they wanted to bring them food. Well, they went to other places, brought in a lot of food. Bella and her husband were with another couple, the 4 of them escaped together. And she said, no, we're starving, but we're not going to eat. We need a tablecloth. She said, I didn't live through these 5 actually horrible years to eat like a pig. I want the dignity of a tablecloth. I want the table to be set. And the GIs went out and, quote, liberated, her term, table linens, nice silverware. Bella set the table and they all sat down to eat. As free people, she said. As free people, the tablecloth was a symbol to her of regaining her personhood. It's a beautiful story. Beautiful. Pump me for more questions.
I have questions, but I want to make sure people in the group get a chance. So, okay, so Myrna, I know we've talked about how at first male scholars didn't.
Oh, it was horrible.
But what turned the tide?
Well, what turned the tide was the publicness, okay, of Gabriel Schoenfeld taking his smaller article from commentary and managing to get it on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, condemning the women scholars. There were 7 of us, the women scholars who were talking about women during the Holocaust. And he was so clueless. He didn't realize, he was not aware of the narrowness of his comments, of his argument. So many people, the GIs women who met the GIs when they liberated them, the GI said to them, we could not imagine women in this condition. We just didn't think of it, that women would be treated this way, made prisoners this way, so on. So what Schoenfeld did was open up the eyes of people who hadn't thought about the, quote, victims, survivors. And people said, why not talk about women? They're half the population. And they were part of this horror, very much a part. So I think that was really a turning point. It took some time for us to get sessions at conferences on the Holocaust. As one of my friends, John Roth, says, now you can't have a conference without a few sessions about women or by women and so on. It's very interdisciplinary. We have artists talking about women's art. There are quite a number of survivors, women survivors who became artists, and they're very dark paintings. Just as men, their paintings are just as dark. But so now the field is really interdisciplinary, and people want to know, what is that experience like? What meaning did it have? What do we learn from it? And one of the things that we learn is we won't stand for dictators. We won't stand for racism. And that's a very simple lesson, but a hard lesson to live by in a government, in a diverse society. But I think that the phrase that I heard most often was, if you see an injustice, open your mouth. There was a time in the 30s and the 40s where Jews tended to say, don't make waves, let it go, because they didn't want to bring attention to themselves and become victims, or a focal point of hatred. But that's not the right, we learn the opposite is true. When you see an injustice, open your mouth. You can't let a minor thing like a dirty name, okay? You can't talk. I lived in the South for a while, and I used to hear the phrase, well, she Jewed him down. That is such an anti-Semitic phrase, but I didn't know what to say at that time. I was really intimidated, but I never heard it. I came from Brooklyn. I never heard that phrase. So I was taken aback, but you can't, no matter where I'd go in the South, I'd open my mouth, and I would not let a slight go by. And I would not let a racist remark go by. It doesn't matter who is doing the attacking, or who is the victim of that attack. You can't. You have to speak up. You have to be strong enough and confident enough to not let it happen again, or not create the society that lets it happen. And that's politics. And I don't want to go into politics, but that's politics.
If you have a question about just terminology, just please say something. Like, if you don't know what it means to juice somebody down, it usually means, get the lowest price possible.
Those are anti-Semitic.
We talked about Kaddish, which is the prayer for the dead. We talked about why men were so easily identified, because if they were outside the ghetto, a Nazi could just have him drop his pants.
Well, they often said, drop your pants.
Right. And then it would be identified that they were circumcised.
Yes. Yeah. Right. And that was That was a mark that they couldn't hide. That's why women were more easily passed. That's why children were more easily hidden. Female children were more easily hidden, because you could somehow integrate them into like a niece or a nephew in your family. A boy was much more suspect. So it was easier for women to survive in that sense.
Yeah.
Does everyone know why it was easier for women? Why men?
But men were circumcised. Jewish men have to be circumcised. And, women don't have such a mark. Women were not identified by the physical that way.
I have one more question before we finish, but any other questions?
I do have one question.
Yeah.
For the families, these surrogate families that the women formed in the camps, for those that survived, were any of them able to stay in contact with one another?
Yes. In fact, those were usually lifelong friendships, without a doubt. Yeah. All the women that I know who were part of surrogate families, even though they were on different continents, they still celebrated each other's families' events. Yes, they did. Men were in groups. I mean, men were in prayer groups or study groups, but not in the same way. They did not attribute their survival to another man in the same way that women did. And that, I think, is a matter of pre-camp socialization. Men were taught to be solo, to be, independent and so on. Women were not socialized the same way prior to World War II. Yeah.
Can we talk about cooking
We did talk about cooking.
as a continuum?
Maria Amelia, did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you so much because I'm learning a lot and it's super helpful. And I'm kind of like matching a lot of stuff with what through our research we've kind of been finding. And you said a lot of men flee right before women, if I got that right.
Yes.
So that seems to be very present here in Ecuador because there's a lot of men intervening for like for them bringing their families here.
Yeah.
That tends to be something that's very common. And also one of the things we found and we keep finding is that these Ecuadorian council would make up families, and for that, thinking about the role of women were so important because he would made up families stating that, well, this and this and these people are married, and so, or like the sister, or like for instance, he would mention a lot of like extended family relationships that were not always real, right? Kinship was taken, and that's how they were able to get a visa, and that's where that they were able to come, and so on and so forth. So I'm actually learning a lot. And if there is anything else that you could tell us on how the role of women kind of like in later on making up and building communities outside, or like the ones that were able to leave Germany before, or like Europe before the Nazis got to them.
Well, I think it's kind of universal that women before World War II, really, and even to some extent now, women tend to bond in groups to help other women or to help other families. You have groups of women in church groups. Women do things. They do good stuff, and they bond that way, very purposefully. And the same thing was in the Jewish community prior and after. I don't think it's unusual. Women are socialized. It is not an essential trait of women, okay? I really don't believe that it is genetic, but I do believe that it is socialized. And it's an expectation that women will create family, and women will create groups that are almost like rescue groups. If you look around, you'll see, especially in these times and where there's poverty, that women are often, not always, but often at the head of creating help groups. It's a transfer from their prior pre-camp concentration camp lives to an adaptation in the concentration camp. I don't think it's unusual, but I do think that we didn't see it so much. Women didn't talk about their experiences until, well, like 20 years, 30 years after the war. And they began to be interviewed and questioned, and it was safe to talk about their experiences then. I don't know that women or even men felt that it was safe to talk about their experiences right after the war, because, as I said, the survivor was thought to be sheep. The survivor was thought to be victim, and they had to create a sense of self, and they did. That was more. They had more agency. There were lots of suspicions about survivors as well. That how did you survive? What did you do to be able to survive? Kind of ugly and nasty kind of questions, but people ask that, and it shuts survivors up. They were not going to be. That's an abuse, and they were not going to let themselves be abused that way. So for some survivors, it was really painful. For other survivors, they managed. They said, they knew what they had done. They knew the strength of their own self and their own ability to survive, and that's important. Yeah, don't forget 6 million died. So that's a big bunch, 2/3 of the Jewish population of the world. So it's pretty awful.
So, Myrna, looking to the future, are there any lessons you would extract from the future? Is there any way that you would like to see research go in the future? If any,
I think that interdisciplinary research is very important, but our primary sources are not there. If we find more diaries, and it isn't unlikely that that we wouldn't find them, we're always finding more material, and we have to examine them. We have to also understand that memory. This is you may not want to hear this, but memory is different 20 years later, 40 years later, 50 years later. So we can't look at memoirs or anything as the gospel. Well, I don't want to use that metaphor. We can't look at diaries, memoirs, and so on as if it were absolute history or accurate history. But we learn from them by the preponderance of what people tell us about that event. And then we back it up by looking at what we have now is a lot of German documentation. We didn't have a lot of the documentation was the Russians. The Russians were the ones who liberated Auschwitz and a lot of other camps, and they kept until 1989. That was off limits to the Allies. It was off limits to anyone from any non-communist country, any scholars from the 89 opened up a whole world for us looking at the Soviet archives, what they held. They held a lot of information about Auschwitz and about other camps. and some of the German documents, archives from Germany. But now it's all open. So if you get a good translator, you can study everything. But I think that Martha, what you're saying, what you're asking is, where do we go from here? With what we know, where do we go from here?
Mhm.
I wish I knew. I can only tell you that for me, it's a matter of voting, living as authentically as you can. I think you can spread kindness and education. Most of the classes, many of the classes, not most, but many of the classes I taught had students who were from besieged countries, students from Cambodia, students from other countries, Afghanistan, where there were large groups of victimized people. And they could identify with what happened. And they were interested because they were comparing. I don't like to compare genocides because I think that's kind of useless, but you learn from some comparisons. But the point is to prevent genocide. And the way to do that is democracy, I have to say it. I mean, I get right down to the political science of it all. And education. You have to teach people what happened, what happens when you don't do certain things. You have to teach people to speak up. You have to teach people to respect other people. And you have to teach people what the consequences are when they don't respect other people. And the consequences are dire and extreme.
Father Dubois, what he's doing,
Excuse me?
what Father Dubois is doing.
Yes. Okay. Again, my husband in the background. Patrick Dubois, the priest I was talking about, he not only went throughout Poland and into Ukraine to find these mass graves and to identify them and to sacralize them, make them sacred. He also he teaches in a seminary. He also took young priests learning how to be priests, young seminarians, to these sites to teach them their responsibility to save humanity. I love that guy. He's remarkable. He's strong. He's quiet, but he does his work. And he teaches at Georgetown. So I taught him one of his classes. It was just a pleasure to teach him and to teach with him. And you have to be an activist for the right things. It's very hard to live with such purpose. It really is. But most of you do. And you vote right, and you live right, and you protest right, and you support what has to be supported. That is part of education. I taught Holocaust literature for about 30 years, and my students still from ages ago write me. And it was very important to them to take that course. Very important. They told me, and I think it's true. It makes you aware of what the possibilities are and how you can help shape the world or your society. It is a tough burden to bear, but it's what is required for the next generation and for ourselves. Yes, women were humiliated, as I said, men were too, but women, because of the way they were raised, were subjected to more humiliation and violence, physical violence.
Different horrors, same hell.
So, okay, more.
Any other?
Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt a little bit, but thank you so much. You are very inspiring. And as someone who in Ecuador, it's such a traditional Catholic country, right? So you can imagine everything that comes along with that, right? There's not much knowledge. There's barely any activism talking about this stuff. And even though we all have, as a country, and also as a South American country, we have our own history on, right?
Yes, yes, you do.
And processes on, like, also, as you said, especially violence against women is extremely bad here.
Yes, in South America, it's extremely bad.
It's extremely bad, yes. So thank you so much for inspiring. And as I continue to research more on, I started this because of trying to understand the life of one person, and I have gotten into I'm realizing what I'm getting myself into, and I am loving it. So thank you so much.
Oh, you are so welcome, and good luck to you. You inspire me, and that's really something. So thank you very much. And I think
Okay.
if you want to take Battalion's book and look at the bibliography, read some of the memoirs rather than the books about the women's memoirs. Read the memoirs themselves, because then you get the feel, you get the heart of a person, and that's important. It's not mediated; it's direct. I think that's important too.
Wow. Thank you so much, Myrna. And thank you, folks, for coming. I'm really sorry more people weren't here. I hope people take advantage of the recording. I don't remember the date of the next meeting, so you will be getting something in your inbox. And as you know, my work in the past few years has been in more the touchy-feely end of things, but you're lucky because we can't hug because we're on screen. So I'm just gonna wave goodbye and thank you all for being here.
Thank you for being there, and you can be ambassadors to spread goodness. Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good
Thank
night.
you
so much.
Myrna, for
Good
being
night.
here. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, everyone.
So, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Night.
Night.